Welcome. My name is Sarah Buescher, and I'm Associate General Counsel at the IAA, and we are delighted to have you here at our conference and here at our panel to discuss ESG investment issues. And we have a great panel with us today. I'm going to do introductions. Paula Bosco is CEO and co-founder of Activus Risk Management. Gwen Williamson is a partner at Perkins, Coie. And Elizabeth Halterman is Vice President Legal Counsel for T. Rowe Price, and their bios are available in your materials. For questions, we encourage you to ask questions as we go along. We think it'd be helpful to have this be an interactive session. Also, too, if you've got observations on ESG investing that you'd like to share, I think everybody would find that useful. If you'd prefer to give your questions to Chris, he's collecting cards, or feel free to put your hand up, we'll take it either way. So for our agenda today, we're going to cover regulatory developments first in the U.S. and then talk about what's going on outside the U.S. because that's where a lot of the activity is. We're also going to talk about stewardship codes. That's a question that we get a lot at the IAA, people asking about different stewardship codes and what does that mean and should I sign up? So we're going to talk about those. And then we're going to spend a lot of time talking about compliance issues. So what are you thinking, if you're thinking about ESG investing, what does that mean? Or if a client approaches you and says, tell me about your ESG compliance program, how do you respond? So we're gonna get into some of those issues and why you might tailor an ESG policy for your firm rather than sign on to something like the UN Principles of Responsible Investment. So we are gonna start with the US and I'm gonna turn to Gwen.
Sure, hi, good morning. The regulation of ESG investing in the U.S. is really still very much in development, particularly in the asset management space. There are laws out there on disclosure for public companies. There's a materiality threshold. They basically have to disclose material ESG risk and other topics in their offering documents and 10-Ks. In 2016, the SEC, in looking at updates on Reg SK, considered ESG data, and more recently, it's popped up at the SEC in the public company space. The Investor Advisory Committee in December 2018 had expert testimony on sustainability and other topics that informed. That's intended to inform the SEC's regulatory priority setting. So it very much has been and is on the SEC's mind, it seems. And if it wasn't, of their own accord, it would have been immediately when they received a rulemaking petition in October of last year from a group of academics and industry players, basically asking for some regulatory coherence in the ESG area. Like I said, there's rules for public companies, and there are petitions, there are public talking points, there's all sorts of ideas out there. But this group really thinks, and I agree with them, that some standardization in the area from a regulatory perspective would be welcome. Please.
And the premise behind that, right, is because ESG impacts so many cross sections of society, right, dealing with social issues, human capital issues, human rights, economic justice issues. And so this group of investors are really focusing on bringing together some kind of standardization because this is really an amorphous area. And there's, like Gwen said, there's not a lot of regulatory requirements out there. And also just there's a lot of differentiation between the stewardship codes that currently exist.
Well, and ESG means different things to different people, right? It's very amorphous, very subjective at the current time, and it's somewhat ideologically driven, right? So it can mean different things to different people. And this group, I think rightfully so, is asking for some guidance. In September 2017, OC had a risk alert on the most common deficiencies observed in examinations of advisor advertising practices, and it's important to keep in mind that one of the things that they noted there was just statements about titles and designations and adherence to voluntary performance standards. That's not not exactly on point in the ESG context, but you could certainly see them applying the concept to advisors asserting ESG expertise and the like without proper documentation and backup on that.
And we'll talk a little bit about this as we go on, but there are many of the federal securities laws that are implicated when you're making statements about being ESG compliant or complying with certain principles. An example of the marketing rules, SEC marketing rules, and so you really want to be careful with those landmines.
Right, and we've of course also got all of the anti-fraud rules under all the securities acts. So the SEC. Sorry.
Let's say you have an advisor and you say we believe in ESG, or we have an ESG policy, but you have a variety of things, and so we can have public, private, etc. Can you choose to have ESG to apply with certain funds and not others, or if you're an advisor and you adopt an ESG policy, must it apply to your entire platform?
No.
You could repeat the question.
Wow. Okay, that's a really good question, and you guys jump in. But what I'm seeing across our client base is that advisors are taking a differentiated approach, and so they will apply ESG to certain funds. They may apply it at the GP level and the firm level, and not to their portfolio companies, and vice versa. And so there's no prescription. But what the key takeaway that we all want from everyone in this room is if you decide to have a policy and decide not to have a policy, make sure you document the reasons why and follow up with that documentation.
Right, and I think that's a really good question because there's a difference in ESG strategies at the fund or separate account level, right? And then an ESG policy that relates to the advisor's operations. So an advisor could, in theory, have an ESG policy for its advisory firm, its business, and not do any ESG investing. I think that would be, unlikely, but they are distinct, and there's different compliance questions and issues around both. The SEC is not the only agency involved here. DOL, our close friend, has spoken about ESG investing for the past 4 years now. In 2015 and 16, there were a couple of field bulletins that spoke to ESG investing and also shareholder activism, and basically said it was okay for ERISA fiduciaries to engage in that as long as it was part of an economic consideration that was revenue driving. They came out with another field bulletin last year that was sort of confusing. It seemed to contradict, but not exactly, more to sort of limit the prior guidance, which said that you can consider, that ERISA fiduciaries can consider ESG factors only if they contribute to financial performance, and that's true even if you have an ESG investment strategy. So that introduces some complex portfolio management questions at best.
But that is important though, because prior to that, right, the whole question was, ESG is about doing good, and that's great, but how does it relate to performance, right? And then some asset managers were concerned that, hey, if we take in these ESG issues into consideration, are we actually violating our fiduciary duty? And so for the DOL to come out and say, affirmatively, you are not violating fiduciary duty if you take these factors into consideration was a huge move.
Gwen, have you seen any changes? Because it does seem like the DOL guidance, depending on the administration, kind of goes in different directions. Have you seen any changes by firm practices based on the recent field assistance bulletin?
I have not. Have you, Paula?
Okay.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. It does seem like this is an area where, again, it depends on the administration. The guidance seems to go back and forth, but we also haven't heard of any big changes on it due to that bulletin. So.
Yeah.
So I guess we will hear if there are any other big developments from the DOL. But the GAO has also opined, put its foot in the ring, so to speak, on ESG, and speaking to the U.S. retirement plan, retirement investment economy, a real recommendation to Congress that investment risks related to ESG be be given some priority in terms of guidance publication. Very concerned that we're sort of behind the international sphere on this. Paula, I'm sorry, Elizabeth, we'll talk about that in just a minute, but other countries besides us are sort of way ahead here, and that presents risks to our economy. Was sort of the gist of this report. Even more recently, we've heard about the new Green Deal has been in the news, very Democratic Party-driven legislation focused on climate change, and also a letter last month from Senators Warren and Sanders, and had a number of others signing on, speaking specifically to the risk of deforestation caused by the use of palm oil, actually, that goes into more things than I think we could even imagine. But that was a letter from some Democratic senators to the likes of J.P. Morgan, BlackRock, Fidelity, and the like. The states have also gotten in the ring, some, California in particular, CalPERS and CalSTRS, their big state pension plans. There's legislation in the works to have them report on climate risk in their portfolio. And then the state of Delaware, which is important, because many businesses are formed there, has adopted a voluntary transparency and sustainability program where Delaware-based businesses can report on climate risk and other types of ESG factors in their portfolios. And the idea there is that even though it's voluntary, it would be a sort of standardized disclosure system.
Yeah. And there's the other thing I wanted to mention. The House Financial Services Committee is going to have a hearing later this month on March 26th regarding proposals to improve ESG disclosures. So again, it gets back to the corporate disclosures. One practical point I wanted to mention on that, one reason we brought up that GAO report is page 31 of that report actually lists sample RFP questions that they got from UK and European pension authorities about the kinds of questions that these European pensions are asking about ESG issues. So, it asks, for example, provide 2 examples of when ESG issues have influenced your investment decisions. Detail to what extent ESG risks are monitored as part of your overall risk management function. So it gives you a sense of you're thinking about, all right, I'm thinking about getting into this issue, what questions might I see? I thought that was an interesting list. So again, we'll see if there's more to come on the U.S. front. At this point, we're going to turn to Elizabeth, who's going to give us an update on regulatory issues outside the U.S., of which there are many and much more wide-ranging, I would say.
Yes, and like Gwen mentioned, the regulatory developments outside of the U.S. in this area are happening at a much more rapid pace, and they are also more broad in nature. And the most extreme example of this is in the European Union, where last year the European Commission proposed a pretty substantial package of legislation with the express goal of reorienting capital flows towards sustainable investments, and with an underlying goal of meeting the European Union's targets under the 2016 Paris Accord and the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. In fact, the legislative proposals themselves state that an additional 180 billion euro would be needed per year in order for the European Union to meet that target. And so in terms of the specific regulations, there are 3. First, to establish a taxonomy or a commonly understood set of terms and definitions around ESG issues, and also would include a classification system to be able to determine which economic activities and products can be labeled as sustainable. The second of those regulations was to establish a low carbon and positive carbon impact benchmarks in the EU and provide a set of guidelines for benchmark providers who want to track sustainable companies. And then third, and I think with having the most impact on firms like T. Rowe Price and others here, is a regulation on disclosure around ESG considerations that would cover investment firms, pensions, insurance-based products, investment advice, individually managed portfolios, and would require disclosures around procedures in place to integrate sustainability risks into investment decisions, and the extent to which those risks could potentially impact the financial outcome for those investments. And then for anyone covered offering green products, ESG funds or ESG-related services, there would be heightened disclosures related to how these investment strategies are being met. And also, and here's where it gets really wonky, would be an additional disclosure around not only how sustainability risks are impacting the investment, but how certain investments are impacting sustainable growth or having an environmental impact, carbon footprint, et cetera. And in addition to those 3 regulations, the European Commission also proposed to amend existing rules. And so earlier this year, ESMA consulted on some technical amendments to MiFID II, UCITS Directive, and AFMD that would incorporate ESG considerations into the suitability requirements. So in practical terms, that means that advisors will be required, most likely through some kind of survey, to ask clients about their sustainability preferences and then be able to show on an ongoing basis how they're taking those preferences into account when making investment decisions.
So it's pretty wide-ranging. It's not just about disclosing what you do, but it's also making sure with each client, and not just clients that say they have an ESG preference, but for all clients reaching out and determining their sustainability preferences. So
Yes.
it's a really broad set of proposals and consultations. The IAA did do a comment letter early last year to the European Commission, and we made 2 primary points. The first point being that you should preserve and not dilute the duty of advisors to act in the best interest of their clients. I think a big concern that's come up by a lot of asset managers is, look, we have clients that have an ESG portfolio, but then maybe they have another portfolio that is not ESG driven. And so you want to preserve the ability to make sure you're acting in the client's best interest and listening to your client. The other point that we made is you need to provide flexibility in this area. What the sustainable issues are in 2019 may not be what they are in 2025, and you need to acknowledge that and have a flexible framework. But I'm curious, what are other comments that you've heard about on these proposals?
Well, the 2 main points I think raised in IA's letter are echoed commonly throughout all the feedback to the EU. Another theme that we've seen is around the timing and sequencing of the proposals themselves. Many feel that the taxonomy, being sort of foundational to the other components of what the EU is trying to do, should be completed first before moving forward with the others. And why consistent terms matter, if you think about the example I gave earlier of advisors being required to ask their clients about sustainability preferences. Well, what does that mean? What does sustainability preferences even mean? And then without a classification system in place, it'll be very challenging to then be able to show that you are taking those preferences into account without any ability to label products. And interestingly, in ESMA's own consultation on the amendments to MiFID, UCITS, and AFMD, they note the challenges from their perspective of trying to formulate these prescriptive requirements while all these other pieces are still up in the air. And then to frustrate that even more, last week, the European Council, Parliament, and Commission agreed on the benchmark-related regulation and the disclosure regulation, but the taxonomy has yet to even enter the trilogue negotiations among those policymakers, and that's expected later this year after the parliamentary elections. I think that just highlights how quickly the EU is trying to move for political and to meet that in specific target with these legislations. They're moving very quickly, but maybe not sequencing in the right order.
And then I think you hit the nail on the head with the regulatory issue, right? I think it's just a matter of time before the SEC, and I apologize, my back is to kind of half the here. I think it's just a matter of time before the SEC and other regulators start creating this rulemaking around it. But before they do that, right, what does the SEC typically do? They go out, they canvass the firms, they see what's going on in the marketplace, So I think to the extent that the industry kind of bands together and gets on the same page about doing something around ESG and creating some of its own consistency, that will drive what the regulators ultimately require.
I think that's a good point about the SEC's focus, and in the U.S., the focus is really on improving the quality and consistency of corporate disclosure, where abroad we're seeing the focus in many other areas. And the EU, again, is sort of a very extreme example. In the UK, the government has put out some discussion papers that indicate that the UK is also interested in a long-term goal of reorienting capital flows to sustainable investments, but more for the purpose of long-term sustainable growth and not to meet any specific targets. And the FCA has given indications that they believe this can be done through more disclosures and not the prescriptive ESG integration requirements that are happening in the EU. And then sort of another even more measured approach is being taken by Hong Kong. They're expected to finalize their strategic framework for green finance later this month, and that is focused more on improving corporate disclosures and also with an investor protection angle to combat greenwashing. And when we say greenwashing, we mean sort of the potential for misleading claims to be made about the sustainability or greenness of a particular product or service.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So there is a lot out there internationally. We just wanted to provide a flavor on it because it's something that you need to be aware of, I would say, if you're in this space, because the U.S. just has a different approach than other countries on this issue. So with that, we're going to move to a discussion of stewardship codes and related principles. This is an area where we do get a lot of questions at the IAA around, tell me about these stewardship codes and should I sign on? And there's a few different sets of them. The first set, I would say, is more regional. You have a UK stewardship code, EU, Japan, and there are some common components, I would say, that flow through those. They tend to take what they call a comply or explain approach. So, you're either complying with them or perhaps for some of the principles in the stewardship code, you're explaining why you're not complying or you're doing a flavor of it. So they call it kind of a comply or explain approach. They explain stewardship as monitoring and engaging with companies on governance, capital structure, performance, strategy, and other issues. Some of them also talk about conflicts of interest and the need to manage conflicts of interest with regard to stewardship. Of course, no surprise, they talk about proxy voting and need for a clear proxy voting policy. Some of them also contemplate active management with issuers and in terms of escalation. So if there's an issue around a particular matter, that they would expect you to escalate that with the corporate issuer. The stewardship codes also talk about acting with other investors where appropriate, and then also reporting to clients on stewardship activities. So there's a lot there. And it's something, before you want to sign on to something like this, you need to think about, all right, what's in there? How do I comply with it? How do I make sure I can continue to? So, and we'll get into more of that. And so there's the national and regional codes. There's also some other things out there, and we've got a couple slides that mention those. The Investor Stewardship Group is something that's more U.S.-based. You have the UN PRI, which is a popular term, the Principles for Responsible Investment. UN Sustainable Development Goals, those are a little bit broader. One thing, too, Elizabeth mentioned, you mentioned on the UK side, there's going to be some proposed changes to the UK code, right?
Right, yes. Just last month, the UK government proposed amendments to the UK Stewardship Code that expressly mention ESG factors, and signatories will be expected to consider those factors when fulfilling their stewardship duties. And this is an open consultation. It closes on March 29 for anyone who's interested in providing feedback to the UK government on that.
I think that's the other thing generally about all of these issues is that they change. So if you, in terms of signing on to something, keeping on top of those changes.
That's true, and we expect this to be a trend in other stewardship codes, and it falls in line with what we're seeing in the regulatory sphere, where regulators are having an increased focus on integrating ESG into the investment process as a whole, and stewardship codes turning to be more focused on integrating ESG factors into a firm's engagement policy itself.
Okay, I'm now going to turn it over to Gwen and Paula to talk about some other standards that are out there.
Sure. So, this one. Guess my mic is not working. Sorry about that. Thanks. So let me just step back for a second, because we're talking about regulations and rules and stewardship codes and standards, and what's the difference, right? And all of this can make your head spin. And why would anybody voluntarily do this? And the whole point of the standards and the codes is that they are voluntary. But what is really good about them is that they do provide a framework, or at least a starting base, for asset managers in particular to start thinking about their ESG policies, right? We hope that asset managers link ESG practices to long-term investment, good long-term investment performance. But if they're not there yet, there are other reasons why you would adopt an ESG policy and maybe sign on to one of these standards or codes. And a lot of it has to do with fundraising, especially in the private fund context. And if you're taking institutional money, those institutional investors, the state and local pension funds in particular, really want to know about what you're doing around ESG. And more important, they are focusing on ESG as a risk management tool. And so there, like Sarah said, there's a number of standards out there. Probably the three most popular. I'm not going to go through all the details of all of them, but there's, again, a nice outline that Gwen put together, and they all have websites with a ton of information, so I encourage you to take a look. But GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, is a pretty common initiative. The two others are the UNPRI, the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investing, and those principles, there are 6 of them, and again, they're on the website. But it's based on the notion that ESG issues affect the performance of investment portfolios. So it's no longer about just doing good. It's linking investment performance with ESG practices. The UN SDG, which are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, like Sarah said, are much broader than the UNPRI. They're focused around what practitioners around the globe think are the 17 most pressing social issues. And so again, very broad topics like education, access to health care, poverty, homelessness, hunger, gender equality issues. So more broad topics. SASB, and Gwen will talk a little bit about SASB, but SASB has a framework that takes a look at categorizes businesses according to sector and industry, and then looks at the material issues that are most likely within those sectors and industry to affect performance. And so there's a nice matrix there. You can take a look, and that will act as a framework for you to develop your own policy. The other thing I wanted to mention is the SSI, which is the Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative. And this is an initiative that requires stock exchanges around the world to incorporate ESG practices into things like their listing requirements, annual report disclosures, other types of things. And so just for our purposes, New York Stock Exchange and the NASD are both part of the SSI. So I don't know if there was something that you wanted to add on SASB or...
No, I think that was a great summary, Paula, but I would just add on SASB that it can be of particular use to private fund advisors that have either strategies or sleeves with an ESG focus. The really detailed factors that SASB has put together for each of the industries that it has these standards for, they can be used by advisors for all sorts of purposes. I have some clients that have referred to them in setting up their ESG portfolio management processes and compliance testing around those. Take a look at them if you haven't, and you've got sort of a vacuum where you might like to have some information, because it may not be exactly on point, but it is a good reference framework.
And the other main point is that all of these standards and stewardship codes, they're all voluntary and really based on information that the signatory provides in terms of its reporting, but there really isn't any verification that goes on, and that's a big criticism of these stewardship codes, is that there isn't a level of verification, and so a lot of the information that's out there is reported by the asset manager or the company themselves.
Yeah. I'm curious, just wanted to get a sense from the audience, have any of your firms signed on to any of these codes or, okay. All right, so we do have some out there. So interesting, we wanted to get a sense of that.
Just one other thing that I want to mention, and you're probably familiar with this, is the American Investment Council, which is formerly the PEGCC, has standards, not an actual framework, but investment beliefs, what they call, related to ESG, and so that relates specifically to private equity.
Okay. All right, so that gives you a framework of the regulatory landscape and also some of the standards and codes that are out there. We thought we would move on next to ESG compliance and what you need to consider, why you might develop your own policy. So I think first of all, a key question, and this came up earlier with the question that you raised, is what do we mean by ESG, right? There's different levels of that, so let's talk about that.
We do a lot of work with clients around developing ESG policies, and by far, we spend most of our time talking about the reasons why you want to do this. And I always tell my clients, I say, look, really just keep it simple. It doesn't, when you start to get into these codes and these stewardship issues, it becomes very complex. And it all has to be based on your business. So think about what your goals are with respect to ESG. Are you a private equity fund that is starting fundraising and trying to take institutional capital? Because those constituents will obviously be interested in ESG. But we spend a lot of time thinking about who are your key stakeholders and is ESG important to them? Because that will drive how big or how small, how simple, how complex your ESG program becomes.
Yeah, just thinking about when you talk about stakeholders and what do those stakeholders expect? Is this just about, Gwen, like you mentioned earlier, is this just about your portfolio? Mm-hmm. Or is this about the firm itself? Or if I'm a private equity firm, is this about what firms I'm acquiring mm-hmm. and what goes on in those firms? So I think you first need to level set, what is it that we're talking about? At what level? I mean, I think a common level where this comes up is at the portfolio management level. So let's start with that. And there's different approaches, right? There's integration and exclusion. I think again, in terms of integration, that kind of goes through your firm. So that may be more looking at portfolio management and ESG integration at a higher level. But there's also the exclusion-based investing, which is that might be much more at a portfolio or account level.
Exactly.
And Elizabeth, how does T-Rowe from that approach, how do they approach that?
Right, so at T-Rowe, we take a full ESG integration approach into all of our investment processes, so not solely focused on labeling certain funds as green, but more integrating the consideration of ESG data and factors into all of our investment decisions. We do this, sometimes do leverage third-party data, but we've established an in-house proprietary ESG research model that our investors can use for that purpose.
How many of you use third parties with respect to ESG investing? Okay, so a fair number. Use third-party data?
Third-party data, yeah.
Okay.
What type of third-party data? Like MSCI? For those of you in the room who are not familiar with MSCI, they have they rate public companies based on ESG factors. So.
And again, I think with third parties, you have to think about the issues you think about with any third party. So if you're relying on a third party for ESG information, what kind of oversight and due diligence are you doing there? So,
well, and I'll add, third parties can assign advisors and funds ESG rankings with or without your knowledge, and so that's something to sort of keep an eye on. And to the extent that you want to use those third party rankings as advertising, for example, it's really important to do your own independent verification of how they came up with that ranking, what it was based on, to do some due diligence there to just make sure that it's not a misleading assertion.
So certainly portfolio management is a large component of ESG compliance issues, but there's a number of others. Let's talk about proxy voting and engagement policies. What kind of issues do you see in that area? Gwen, I'm going to ask you about that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Advisors can have established proxy voting guidelines, right? And those are, you can sort of rely on those as a default approach, or you can take more active engagement in proxy voting. I think in the ESG sphere, whatever you do needs to be consistent with disclosures and commitments to clients, including in the asset management agreements, right? If you've got investors that think that you are investing 100% in green companies, it would be inconsistent, right, to vote a proxy on, I don't know, to build a new oil refinery in a park or something like that. But so it's, proxy voting in my mind sort of underscores the need for a holistic approach to ESG in a firm, depending, of course, on the extent of your ESG involvement. If you're just going to dabble in it, probably not needed, not necessary for the CCO to come in and sort of do a holistic incorporation into the compliance program. But if you've got a lot going on, there should be compliance controls in place to ensure that proxy voting is in line with all ESG commitments, whether directly to clients or in advertising and the like.
And Paula, this probably gets to a point you made earlier, especially with certain kind of clients, like pension funds and things like that. You may need to make sure that your proxy voting and engagement policies, for that matter, are in line with what they expect, right?
Exactly, and also to make sure that those policies are consistent over time and consistent across your affiliates, consistent across your funds, and if they're not, make sure you document the reasons why they're not. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I just want to say, it's like when you're sitting here listening to all of these things, you're probably thinking, where do I start with this, right? And so I always tell my clients, think of it as a flow chart. Start with any legal or regulatory requirements, right? Ask yourself that question. Are you doing business in a state that has ESG mandates, laws, legislation, anything that the SEC or the DOL is doing, or any of the regulators if you're operating outside the U.S., and just kind of take it from there and figure out what your requirements are. But then don't forget to look back at your documents, right? Look at what the investment mandates are for your funds. Is there anything contained in your documents that require you to do certain things or require you not to do certain things, right? So you want to go back and look at your DDQs, especially if you're taking institutional investor money. Do they have any mandates or restrictions? And you want to, side letters are a big thing. Make sure you're looking at your side letters, see if there's any ESG issues in there. And from there, then you can think about the scope of what you want your ESG policy to be, and then start taking a look at these stewardship codes to see which is the most practical for your business operations.
And as we were preparing for this panel, one thing that we were speculating is whether the SEC at some point is going to come out with a risk alert in this area, because when you think about it, we've got their ESG disclosures, responses, and statements. Often what these OC risk alerts are all about is, looking at your disclosures, your Form ADV filings, your policies and procedures, and do all those mesh together. And, even if OC's not asking about it, you might have clients that do. So this is, I think, a big area that comes up, and this has been a big area of questions, is, well, how do I respond to this RFP when they ask me, am I an ESG advisor? Well, that's not something that can be done in a vacuum. That's something where, you've got to, work across your firm to figure out what is it that we're doing and what is it that I can say about it. But as we were preparing for this conference, we were thinking that this may be an area where we see more in the future as people hold themselves out as ESG advisors, and this may be something that the SEC starts to focus on. So it's important, that your disclosures, your policies and procedures, advertising, all of that needs to line up.
And Sarah, that's a great point, because from the asset owner perspective, one of the trends that we're seeing at Activus is that the asset owners, the state and local pension funds, are relying on the information that the asset managers provide through the RFPs and the DDQs and their ongoing quarterly certifications, right? And for a long time, especially when the market was doing well, and the asset owners, I think, will admit this, is that they have not been focusing on those responses, that it has become, or that traditionally it's been more of a check-the-box exercise. But we're seeing, in the RFPs in particular, is that ESG is looped into the risk management section. So under risk management is where they're asking their ESG questions. And ESG questions have gone from being 2 or 3 to being 4 pages to 8 pages long. I've seen RFPs with 8 pages just on ESG.
Just on ESG.
Right.
Have you seen if there's a particular area that tends to trip people up, or in those 8 pages of questions, are there certain areas where you may need to counsel clients to say, wait a minute, let's talk about this further?
Yes, and the pitfall that we see with clients is, especially with the private fund context, is that they start to look at ESG only when they start fundraising, right? And so they're not spending a lot of time on the operational diligence around ESG issues that they do on their other prospects. And so usually it's a last minute thing. They're responding to these questions kind of off the cuff, and then just kind of looking generally and making very general comments about what they do from a social perspective that sounds very ESG-y, but is not. And the asset owners are starting to call them on that. And so what we've been seeing is asset owners have hired us in particular to do verification, ESG verification, on certain money managers. And that differs across different asset owners. They will sometimes take a look at their top 10 or their top 5 or their top 3 based on performance or size or whatever their internal criteria is, but they ask us to actually do the verification. And we've had one instance where we were working with an asset owner, did diligence on a money manager around ESG. The money manager was not doing what they said they were doing for a period of almost 6 years, and the asset owner fired the manager. Yeah.
That is greenwashing.
Yeah.
Right? And I think it's just important to keep in mind in responding to RFPs, there's a very human inclination to sort of oversell and to just simply not do that. Everybody's in the same boat here with this sort of developing and coming about, right? So again, as always, just be as truthful as you can in your RFPs as well.
A big area where we see this a lot too is they ask questions around gender equality at the firm level, and so we see a lot of asset managers answering the question, 75% of our staff are women and 40% of the staff are women, period. But when you dig down, 100% of them are admins, right? And there aren't any females in the C-suite, any females at the portfolio management level, and so those are the types of diligence and questions that the asset owners are starting to dig down on.
Those are some of the particular questions, too, that regulators are asking when they're contemplating new disclosures around ESG integration. And with this additional client focus and with the additional regulatory focus, there is a concern that looking at all of the different approaches, which is right, different firms need different approaches, but from a regulatory perspective, that advanced scrutiny on this will lead to more prescriptive requirements about, what are best practices while they're sort of still developing in the marketplace, or, worst case scenario, trying to subscribe a, one-size-fits-all approach to these issues.
And also what I'm seeing is the more work that asset managers tend to do in the space and the more documentation they have around that work goes a long way.
Mm-hmm.
So to the extent you mentioned Esg audits, right? So everybody does their 20647 annual compliance review. And if you have ESG policies, that should certainly be incorporated into that review. But also consider having a separate ESG review that you document separately so that you could also provide that to asset owners who request it as part of the RFP process or part of ongoing due diligence, and that seems to go a long way as well.
I'm a big fan of memos to file for the CCO, sort of, these days, any time an ESG issue comes up, right? It's questionable, conflict, whatever, memo to file on how that was addressed, and then you have your next SEC exam. They come in, they ask about it. Maybe they don't 100% love what you did, but you have the memo that shows that you considered it thoroughly in good faith, and that usually can curb some regulatory appetite from the staff.
Yeah, it seems like these ESG reviews or audits can serve multiple purposes. The next time you've got an RFP, you've got some information to share, and certainly from a regulatory perspective, because
Exactly.
I do think this is an area, as we've discussed in preparing for the panel, I think this is going to be an area of focus going forward. So next thing we wanted to do is, and Paula, you've talked about a lot of this, but how advisors can get started in this area. And we've touched on a number of these points. We talked about assessing the legal and regulatory requirements, interviewing key stakeholders, and talking about practices, and then, developing that framework. That's the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, keep it simple. Figure out what you are required to do versus what you want to do. The other high-level decisions that you should be making is, do we want the ESG policy to extend internally to our firm, at the firm advisor/GP level?
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to, if you're a private equity firm, do we want to push that out to our portfolio companies? If you want to push it out to your portfolio companies, how do you do that? And what I'm finding is the best way, and we've had the most success with clients, is identifying, maybe depending on the size, the nature, the complexity of your business and your operations, identify the 3 or 5 or 10 ESG issues that are most important to your firm, obviously taking materiality into consideration based on where you're investing. But come up with that framework, and then build frameworks around that for your portfolio companies. So if something like gender equality and pay parity is important to you at the firm level, push that out to your portfolio companies, and make that part of the ESG practices across your entire portfolio, but also make sure that you have consistent and regular reporting coming in from those portfolio companies that shows that what they're doing is in line with your ESG policy.
And it seems like building a framework that way is a more effective approach, starting internally and thinking about what's important to your firm and building it that way, rather than saying, okay, I need to comply with this stewardship code out there, so let's develop something to do that. That's probably going to be less effective. And also, these stewardship codes are voluntary.
Right.
So you can adapt your program if needed, but it seems like starting internally is a better approach.
Absolutely, and we've had a number of clients who have taken different aspects of different codes and have created their own policy and code around that, and that has worked just fine as well.
Yeah, it seems like that would be effective in talking with prospective clients too.
Yes.
The fact that you've developed something, even though it may not mirror a specific code, it's got features of many others. So
Exactly.
Well, in a private equity firm's policy on extending ESG out to the portfolio companies, I think, as with all of this, it should be tailored and reflective of the extent of the advisor's involvement in the portfolio companies, right? So if you're sort of hands-off private equity investor, I think that cuts one way.
Right.
If you're a majority investor, if you have a majority stake in the company.
You're on the boards of
exactly.
directors, you've got employees in there doing things. I don't see how you could have a strong ESG policy at the firm level and not push it out to your portfolio companies, but there's, polar ends there.
That's a good point.
And then, as we've talked about, making sure that after you develop a policy, that the operational infrastructure is in place for that.
And the other takeaway too is when you think about, okay, there's a lot of work to do, who's going to do all this work, right? Because I'm a retired CCO and Chief Regulatory Counsel for a private equity firm for a number of years, and I feel the pain of everyone in this room. So the thought of adding another thing onto your list is probably impossible. But you can leverage the resources in your firm. The analysts and the portfolio managers, at least on the private equity side, have those relationships and the direct contact with the portfolio companies. So really, it's a function of you setting up the structure and basically giving those folks marching orders about what information to request and have it funnel through them. Leverage investor relations. That's part of their job. Have them collect the data and report back to you, so you're not running around trying to get all this information.
All right, at this point, we've been doing a lot of talking, so we'd like to find out if there are any questions from any of you or compliance issues. Yes.
Yeah, we took a high-level approach because we had a lot of the RFP DDQ questions, so we created an ESG policy that basically said we consider these factors when, in the due diligence and ongoing due diligence of our portfolio holdings. So how do you test that? Because basically, we look at environment as far as if we own any sort of real estate, what's the impact of the weather and hurricanes and so on. The governance, we look at compensation, which is part of our due diligence process or so on, and we just documented that in the policy. So how would you go about testing that? Because, we're not saying we're not going to invest in a certain company because we take it into consideration and weigh the risk, and we might still buy it.
So basically, the question is how you test how you test due diligence policies that you've set up in this area.
I think a really good recommendation there is to incorporate ESG into the investment committee process, right? Because you want to show that you're doing this consistently across all of your investments. So just like you have financial reporting, just how you have regulatory and legal updates as part of the due diligence, have your deal teams look at certain factors that are ESG related. If you're focusing in an area in the same sector, same industry, that becomes quite easy, right? But if you are diversified across the portfolio, you may want to look at more generic, and you use that as part of your documentation of the investment committee process.
Or we don't have a formal investment committee, we have a risk committee which looks at that.
Or the risk committee, right?
So would the research notes and research files, if that's documented there, would that be enough to test if there's something in the research where they talk about this?
Absolutely, but also think internally, okay, what happens if, it's the same issue if you found a compliance issue at a firm what would you do about that once you took the company over? You would make sure within 90 days that issue was remediated or some other action was taken, right? So you would do the same thing from an ESG perspective and decide internally, okay, we may make this investment even though it lacks ESG qualities or is deficient in ESG and should not be deficient, right, because of based where it is, but document that. And then the steps that you'll take post-close to remediate any of those issues, if any.
I will add that to the extent you want to help your risk committee measure, as you're asking, the SASB standards really have some good reference points there. They are by industry and sector, so it would have to align with your investment strategies, but they have line items of measurement by percentage of the company in question's performance on all sorts of topics, right? So for a healthcare company, it might be what percentage of the laundering costs are allocated to green businesses, right? When you're washing the linens in a hospital, do you use an organic process or not? That's just one very specific item, but SASB really does have some good reference points there that you could use to build a measurement questionnaire checklist for your risk committee.
Other questions? Yes. I'm just going to repeat the question. This is about external reporting on these issues.
So if you sign on to one of the stewardship codes like UNPRI, they require specific reporting around those principles, and you do that internally through their own internal database. So that's an example of some of the external reporting. What we're seeing mostly in the context of private fund advisors is, again, it's driven by your mandates. So if your investors are requiring certain quarterly reporting, you have to give that to them. Then the question becomes, do you want to share it if you're not otherwise required to do it? And we see that asset managers are focusing on their annual meetings, their annual investor meetings, and having ESG slides and ESG presentations typically as part of that process.
And that's what we've done as well. I think I'm finding that particularly with very large U.S. institutions that they are not really sure what they want. And so I was curious, as you advise folks, like, this is what you ought to be capturing internally. on what you're doing for ESG. Do you have a format, or is there anything that you recommend for folks in developing these internal processes?
There's not really a prescribed format because every firm is different, and so we really work with each of the investment advisors to figure out the level and the complexity of the reporting that they want to do, right? Sometimes we'll recommend to an advisor that they don't do any external reporting because of the complexity of their own businesses. We want to make sure that they're not tripping up any other investment advisor Act violations or any other SEC rule violations. So in many cases, we will recommend that they don't do external reporting.
And that sort of underscores the notion that I don't think we've mentioned exactly yet, that these policies should probably be, in most cases, included in your Advisors Act compliance program and subject to the annual risk assessment, right? And so you could add an internal reporting item to your annual risk assessment and on ESG there, and apply your controls and procedures, your controls and procedures to that to inform what you do there.
You talked a little bit about third-party data. For smaller firms investing in publicly traded equities, you have no choice but to use third-party data. Can you explain a little bit more any kind of research that's been done on MSCI or Bloomberg or other third-party data providers, and is there any sense of who's doing well or standards that are being adhered to?
We don't have a lot of information on whether or not the standards are being adhered to, right? Because that's all private, and unless they're reporting externally, we wouldn't have access to that information. But typically what we do when we're dealing with hedge fund advisors is we will take a look at their portfolio, download their investment holdings, and then do an ESG analysis on each holding in the fund to kind of come up with an overall rating for that particular fund in terms of ESG. I don't know if you've seen the Msci reports, but they're pretty good. You can take any public company, they rank them, what the deficiencies are, what they're doing really well, and then that's something that you can report to your investors as well. But also be prepared, right? If a majority of your holdings are coming up short on ESG, what can you really do about that, right? If you're an index-based fund, that you don't have a lot of control over that. But then that's where your policy comes in. At least you talk about the steps that you take and the fact that your investment mandate prohibits you from investing outside of that goes a long way.
All right, well, thank you all very much. And we'll stay up here for a few minutes if you have any further questions. So.